The History of Curriculum in America, Part 2. Alright, so let's remember what we were talking about at the end of Movie 1. The cardinal principles of secondary education, democracy through socialization, remember dance and sports, common knowledge base, good mental health, and positive use of leisure time. Well, what else was going on in 1918? We had the soldiers coming home from World War I and communicating. It gave a stronger sense of what it meant to be an American. And all these different people came to recognize that, they'd fought for their country and they had something to share. They had their own stories. So this brought about the rise of new interest groups, Irish Americans, German Americans, French Americans. Everybody wanted their stories to be told. Well, where is the place that these stories are best told? It's to our children, right? So they wanted credit for their part of history to be in the textbooks. They wanted materials that talked about their group's contributions to the growth of America. And right about this time, we see the start of a trend that actually lasts until the 1970s. Cooling out was this process of mostly high school counselors gently talking to a student, you're such a nice kid. Why are you wasting your time in high school? You know you're not going to go to college, or you're just not college material. It's not the thing. No one in your family has gone. Why don't you start looking at a trade? Because in truth, the schools still weren't prepared to graduate every child. They never planned on it being that way. So all of a sudden they had all these extra people and they didn't know what to do with them. They would just kind of gently, why don't you go over here? Look at this, look at that. Yeah, college, not for you. So let's move into the 1920s, and we have the Scopes monkey trial. This took place in Tennessee, where there was a law in the books that stated you could not teach the Darwinian theory of evolution. You could only teach biblical creationism. This highlights the struggle between what the locals want versus what the greater educational community wants, and that it's still going on to this day. Then we get a little further. We get the very first SAT test, which was actually initially used to give out scholarships at Harvard, but was quickly used by other institutions. I believe Princeton was the very first one to use it for admissions purposes, because they believed that it would give you your best indication if a student was able to be successful in college. But recognize, even at the time, there was quite a bit of controversy by other educational professionals saying this test is not going to give you that information, where you could just as easily look at their high school transcripts. You could look at the outside things that they do outside of academia, what their interests are, how much they're willing to apply themselves. Those are better predictions as prediction-making instruments as far as a student's ability to be successful. And in 1928, something very interesting happened. John Dewey, who had been slowly making a name for himself throughout the 20s, was invited by the Commissar of Education to lead a very prestigious group of American educational professionals into the Soviet Union to share information. So this elevated Dewey to a level of really becoming the face of American and international education. So let's talk some more about Dewey. He is considered the father of pragmatism and the progressive movement, although the truth is, pragmatism was really based upon the ideals of a gentleman named William James. However, what Dewey added to it was this concept of instrumentalism. Okay, let me talk a little bit about this idea. It basically looks at the understanding that the mind is an instrument for realizing purposes, not just an empty vessel to be filled with knowledge. Recognize how different that is than your traditional concept of what the mind is and what the purpose of schooling is. He considered ideas to be these malleable plastic concepts, conceptual tools of the mind that really are only usable and retainable when you think about them in relation to the functions that they serve. So again, just giving someone information doesn't teach them anything. Kids are only able to actually own ideas and understanding and knowledge when it serves them towards some purpose. Thus, learning only happens because of some stimulus, some challenge, some difficulty, some problem to serve, and it's the need of the teacher to find those problems and give real problems for the students to work on. Okay, again, only through doing can there be real learning. Dewey believed in exploring, in problem solving, in making sure that students were involved in doing real stuff that had a purpose. He focused on thinking rather than memorizing. Again, learning by doing. Experience is what you know. So just telling someone a fact never really gives them knowledge. It just is some brief thing that floats about in their brain and then goes away the minute it's not being used. This is key. Dewey considered school to be a part of the community and the world in which it was, not some separate entity where you go and you stick the kids and you pretend like the outside world doesn't exist. He was very anti-authoritarian and the preordained teaching of the traditional kind of education that was all about delivering knowledge rather than trying to understand what the students' experiences are and using those as that kind of stimuli to create opportunities for students to use whatever ideas we give them so that they can then own those ideas. So when we think of Dewey, we think of experiential education, progressive, and he is considered the father of outcomes-based education and standards-based educational reform. Why? Because Dewey's understanding of experiential education was that it had to have a purpose. It wasn't just, let's find a problem, it's children need to understand how to do algebra. So we need to find problems in the real world, in the community around us, where the only way the students will be able to solve it is through having to do algebra. Outcomes-based and standards-based. He was very critical of what many people actually thought he was talking about, which is that whole free student-driven education. It wasn't about just letting the kids go. He recognized that there needed to be the guidance and the leadership of a trained professional educator to ensure that the work being done did have some desired outcome and that there was a standard of learning being met through the experiential education. Okay, and a little bit more about what's going on in the 1930s. Of course, we have the Great Depression. What does this mean? It means the population of the United States is incredibly mobile. Everybody's looking for answers. They're very open. You know, everything was falling apart around people's ears. So the Works Projects Association, which was put together, of course, part of FDR's Great Society rebuild, they would bring artists and storytellers into the schools. So there was this whole re-engagement with the kind of shared history-making, storytelling that was originally a big part of learning, almost as if it was apprenticeship of a narrative form. So again, artists and storytellers, that whole connection to using the whole person, not just sitting down and having knowledge poured into you, begins to make a strong reemergence in our schools. Throughout the 30s, there was this amazing study, which you'll have to take some time and look at. It's definitely worth it, called the 8-Year Study. And what it did was it looked at progressive high schools, the kind that were doing the work Dewey was talking about, based on experiential learning, having these outcomes that the students had to work towards, not just, here, read the book and take my test. This is the website. It's posted in our page for the week, so don't worry about it. Don't try to write this down. You'll be visiting it. As well at this time, we see the introduction of Dick and Jane Basel readers. It was whole word and sight word. This was not phonics teaching. But kids across the country, as you moved, is your parents left Oklahoma and ended up moving out to Nevada and California, you still were using pretty much the same reader, so you could blend into a new school much easier than when everybody used whatever materials they wanted. Run, Spot, Run. See Dick Run. And these actually lasted up until the 1970s.